You have just seen a phase of the low-level attack on Eindhoven. Low-level attacks depend on preparation and precision. Straight in, bombs gone, straight out. No time lost searching for the target. You don't just barge off and find your way by luck and blind faith. For all such attacks, bomber or fighter, precise navigation is essential. A low-level flight must be planned carefully. Time spent on the ground means valuable time saved in the air, when you want to concentrate on keeping out of trouble. For this film, we are choosing an objective in England. The people on the other side wouldn't cooperate. Base, target. Here's a good point to set course from. And here, another good landmark at which to cross the other coast, bearing in mind the defences. Although off the direct line to the target, these prominent landmarks will enable us to check our position easily and quickly. A longer way around with good pinpoints may often prove better than a direct route with vague ones. Get an accurate met wind for the route. Having decided what airspeed you will fly, fill in the rest of your flight plan. Measure your tracks, and using a computer, work out your courses and ground speeds. And calculate your ETAs for each leg, and so on until you have the completed plan. On the map, mark in 10-degree lines to enable you to check drift. Then put in a time scale at your calculated ground speed at 5-minute intervals. 5, 10, and so on.
Moth navigation is very similar to that being taught for low-level pilot navigation during the war. The equipment is similar and the charts are similar, if not a little bit more cluttered with airspace nowadays. So rather than all those navigation aids, it's back to the whiz wheel for planning, which has now been made a little bit smaller and plasticised by poolies, but the basic nav techniques of looking for good features, heading and time remain just the same for VFR navigation as it was during the war.
Well, I thought I was getting towards the end of this filming, and then I thought about navigation and realised that we really did need a little section on it, as it's quite different in a Moth than it is in a modern aeroplane. For a starter, the environment that you're operating in is much harsher. All that noise, vibration, 100-mile-an-hour gale blowing around your head, all that wind circulating around the cockpit. It makes it much more difficult to think and to organise yourself in the cockpit. Let's think about those folks with their nice big flight bags. Well, there's absolutely no room for them in a Tiger Moth. All you've got room for is your map. You certainly won't have capacity in a Moth to be operating your trusty old whiz wheel, so that can go out of the window. We need an easy to operate pilot navigation system where everything is on our map or in our brains. And talking of maps, it's really important to look after map husbandry. If you don't stow it in a pocket or under your thigh or jammed in the side of the seat, it will instantly get sucked under the seat, sucked forward round the rudder pedals, or disappear down the back of the fuselage, or worse still, out over the tailplane. When it comes to operating in an air traffic environment, the Moths are particularly difficult, with usually poor radios, poor headsets, poor intercom, usually no transponder, and it really is hard work trying to work in an ATC environment. So generally, if you can avoid controlled airspace, you're doing yourself a big favour. The Moth series of aircraft, of course, are a lot slower than our modern aeroplane that we'd learn to fly in, such as the Tomahawk. So, for a given wind, our drift angles are much greater. The Moth series of aircraft are also much more unstable in yaw than a modern aircraft, so given a half a chance, if you relax on the rudders and stop keeping the aircraft straight, it will veer off course, unlike its more modern cousin. In a more modern aircraft, you are usually used to a directionally gyro damped compass of some form, whereas in the Moths you've got the real compass, either a P8 or a P11. For that to operate successfully, you need to be in straight, level and unaccelerated flight for a significant period of time to let the needle settle down. It's more difficult to read, is easy to misread, very easy to even get 180 degrees out, and for our more modern cousins like the chipmunk, the direction indicator, which again is pretty old-fashioned, easy to misread and easy to misset. So we're going to be having a look at those two instruments shortly. So let's first have a look at our compass. This is slightly bigger than the normal compass fitted to a Tiger. In fact, I think it came from a Lancaster, but it operates in exactly the same way. As you can see, on the top of it, it has a compass bezel which is rotated by hand and a locking ring. You'll find in the compass that there is a forward line there which is aligned fore and aft with the aircraft. That is known as the lubber line. And to see which heading we're on, we've got a graduated compass circle on the outside of the bezel and a north-south needle. So to check the heading we're on, we need to unlock the bezel and rotate the bezel around such that north on the bezel lies directly overhead the north seeking needle end and that it is parallel. We then read the heading off from here, and as you can see, that is about 339 degrees. So that's the heading we're on at the moment. However, if we want to turn onto a heading, what we need to do is to unlock the bezel and say we want to turn onto 045 degrees. We turn the bezel round onto 045 degrees. At this point it would be useful and in practical sense to say which way is that I'm going to turn, and of course from where we were on 339 it's to the right, so we would then turn our machine round to the right until the north needle ends underneath the north part of the bezel. And I should add that it's prudent to, once you set a heading, to lock the outer ring so that it doesn't vibrate around. One word of warning with these P compasses: it is possible to end up with the needle and the external bezel 180 degrees out, giving you a completely incorrect reading by 180 degrees on the main lubber line. So beware of that, and always make sure that the red north is over the end of the north seeking needle. Now, it's easy enough to do that on the kitchen table, but in practice, until the machine is level on the heading and been given about 30 seconds for the needle to stabilise itself out, you may well find the compass needle itself is swinging all over the place. So as I say, that makes it more difficult to actually turn on the compass than if you're used to a magnetically updated direction indicator. It's for this reason that this thing is invented, called the direction gyro. Initially they were air driven like this old wartime one. To set this piece of kit, you need to check your heading from the main compass and then select it onto the direction indicator by using your knurled knob. So if we're on 339, we select 339, and then when we're steady and level, pull the knob towards you to uncage the gyro. It will then act as a compass, and it's much easier to turn on and is absolutely dead beat. However, having said that, the direction indicator should be updated at least every 15 minutes and checked against the main compass. You can see here the P compass in a gypsy moth. It's actually to the right of the instrument panel. Not the best place to put it, but it works just the same. That we unlock the compass bezel, turn the heading that we want round under the lubber line, and then we need to lock the compass bezel and then turn the aircraft round such that the north seeking needle lies under north. Conversely, if we want to know what heading we're on now, unlock the bezel, rotate it such that the N is over the north seeking needle, and then lock the bezel, and we read our heading from the front of the lubber line about 310. It's not an ideal place for the compass, as from when the pilot's got their head in the normal flying position there's quite a significant amount of parallax. On the Tiger Moth they've moved it down between the pilot's legs, which gets rid of the parallax but means that you need to be seriously head down to operate it. When you're in the cockpit, you don't have much room for a map, so ideally we want to reduce it to the sort of size that we can easily hold in our hand or stick down under our leg or put down in the map stowage. Of course, when using the 250,000 map, you will use more map than if you would with a 500,000. But I would suggest that for mothing, generally the extra detail is well worth it. If you're doing a long distance trip, then you'll end up with a longer map, obviously. So you can, like this leg here, you can actually fold the map over and continue it on the other side to make it easily manageable. However, if you're doing a very long leg of 3 hours, say, and I know that in a tiger moth you'll have run out of fuel by 2.5, but in a gypsy, or if you've got an auxiliary tank, you can operate longer flights, then you end up with a longer map such as this one. And here's one that I think it's actually done for Beaver Castle, and you can see that it's actually quite a large map. So what I've done is to get rid of the bit of map that I didn't want to start with, and then I folded it in half, and then I'm going to fold it in half again and then beat it into submission. That's usually done best on the floor or on a table. And so here I'm going to use the first bit, turn it over a bit, and then in the cockpit it is going to be a bit of a reshuffle where I'm going to have to squeeze it together, fly the next section, and then finally the last section. So the longer maps are less than ideal, but that's the way to fold it. So what I normally do is to stick it under my thigh. I find is the best way that I don't lose it, or down by the side of the seat. Remember, what you don't want to do is to drop it on the cockpit floor where it's going to be sucked forward or sucked down the back end of the fuselage. One of the first things we need to do when planning the route and thinking where we're going to go is to look at the NOTAMs that might be active for our route and the day that we're likely to fly it, and along the sort of area you can do that. And a really useful new technique that's come online over the last couple of years is the Sky Demon system, and you can access the Sky Demon Lite flight planning system for free as a downloadable app. I must admit I'm fairly new to it and I found it really great. Using your tablet, we press on Sky Demon Lite and it opens this picture here. If we want a new route, we go to start again. As you can see here, I've put 2,000 feet in and a speed of 60 knots, and you can put a wind into it, and then that will actually do a plog type thing. Of course, we're going to have to write all the information that we need on our map because we're not going to have room in the cockpit for a plog. But then, once we're on flight details, we touch where we start. So here we're on Solent, and then we'll go up to near Petersfield at Butser Hill. And then should we go across towards Littlehampton and then back to the Spinnaker Tower there. So it draws the route in, and then we can do various things to modify the route, to bend it to different places. I think we'll go down towards Midhurst there, that's our route basically, down towards Littlehampton. We want to stay just clear south of Goodwood, so that's okay, we're going to do that. And so there's our route in it, and the machine will then pick up any navigation warnings, and if we're not sure what they mean, we just press on the nav warning on the binoculars and it will highlight the area concerned. To get the NOTAMs then, we press NOTAM and it loads up the various NOTAMs. So there's a kite problem again with the binoculars that is hardened up in there. And the formation by the red arrows, they're at Bournemouth today because it's the Bournemouth Airshow weekend, and they're going to be flying, as you'd expect, around the Bournemouth area, getting themselves sorted out. So that's how that works. And then if you wanted to, we press a pilot log, and that produces a pilot log for each waypoint, and you feed in the wind and it'll actually do the calculations that you would do on the whiz wheel for track, ground speed and time.
So here's our area actually on the 250,000 map, and it's flying around the West Sussex sort of area, Hampshire, West Sussex. So one of the first things we can do is to put our NOTAM. So I'll put it on pink here, just to the west of Goodwood, where the balloon was. We want to make our navigation as easy as possible, so we're going to pick large, unique features. First of all, we're going to be coming up from the southwest, so we're going to use Petersfield here, which is in a valley floor, but to the south of it is a large ridge which is wooded, and you can see the big mast there at Butser Hill on the top of the ridge with a A3, it's the A3M coming across the ridge down into Petersfield, and a large bypass around Petersfield, so should be able to find that. And then we're going to route eastwards along the valley. You can see here a valley from the left with the road and river, high ground to the north and the south, to the town of Midhurst. Now there are several villages along here in this valley, but Midhurst is also marked by the fairly significant mast that you can see just to the northeast of it, the 996 or 376 foot high mast, which denotes that this is Midhurst rather than Petworth, which is a bit further along. So it's going to turn at Midhurst, and then we're going to route down to the south east to the little airfield of Ford, or disused airfield of Ford, which you might be able to see towards the centre of the page there. It's not actually even shown as well, it's shown as the dotted line, disused airfield at Climping, but from the side we're coming, we're going to come off a wooded area, some motorway, we've obviously got the sea behind it, and we've also got the River Arun stretching southwards, running south from Arundel, wiggling its way out to the sea at Littlehampton. From there, we're going to route westbound along towards South Hayling and the West Witterings and South Sea along the coast then, which will be easy to find obviously because the sea's there, and then back into Leon Solent, which you can see is just by Gosport there. So that leg will be very easy as it's supposed to be a coastal crawl. But always strive to make your navigation as easy as possible by using large, unique features. So once we've decided on our turning points, we can then draw our track lines in. You can see that this is a map that I've used for something else. So forget the 017, the track going off to the left. We're actually going off to the northeast, and I put circles on our turning points such that the turning point itself is not obscured by whatever we've written on the map. Remember, it's that detail that might be very useful to you to make sure you can fly the track precisely at the right turning point. Once that's done, measure up your route, putting 5 and 10 minute marks in, and you can either run the whole route as a continuous time or start timing for each leg. And so you can see up here, it's up towards the top left, I put a little arrow with a line going to the turning point to remind me to restart my stopwatch, the top one there, and then I'll need to draw it in again up by Midhurst to remind me to restart the watch again there. We need to put the protractor on and measure our true tracks, and don't forget to then add probably about 3 degrees for magnetic variation, and put those headings onto the map. Remember, they are still headings and we'll need to adjust those come the day for any wind. We'll come on to how we can adjust those headings using a max drift technique shortly. So once we're all measured up for headings, we then write them in, and you can see here at Midhurst now I've put the start point 150 written a little away from the turning point itself so that it's not obscuring any important information. I can still see the Midhurst turning point and the mast to the left of it. As we progressed eastward towards Midhurst, we're going to start getting towards the Gatwick TMA area, and there's various areas of controlled airspace with base heights. So you can see here I've put in fairly large black pen the lower airspace limit of 3,500 at the bottom left, 5,000, 2,500 and 1,500 feet. Remember that those, when their altitudes, are based on the Gatwick QNH. So it's no good point having the regional pressure setting on, because if you're up towards the limit you might well infringe, so it needs to be the Gatwick QNH there that you're below. Also, I've put the frequency on for Goodwood, and any other diversions of 12245 you might want to have the Shoreham one on, so it's easy to find their frequencies in the air. Now, something that is often forgotten is how you're going to actually start your NavX and how you're going to end it. So here's a close-up of the area of Leon Solent, and it's actually co-located just to the right hand side. You can see the larger dashed line of Fleetlands. So you need to think how you're going to get out of your base airfield and how you're going to get to the start point. We're actually going to start where the line crosses the motorway there at junction 10. In fact, the line goes right over the top of it, badly obscuring the junction number. But you have the option of getting airborne on 05 at Lee and then coming out to the west, routing down the edge of the outside the Fleetlands ATZ and free navving to the start point, or you could take off on 23, turn right hand downwind and then down towards the motorway. Similarly, it's important to think how you're going to rejoin the airfield. Are you going to be able to join overhead, straight in a right hand base, or downwind, or a left hand base? So that will depend upon the activities taking part on your airfield and their standard procedures. But do have a plan and think it through before you set off, and then review it as you start to join the airfield. Give a radio call a while out to find the airfield details and formulate a plan. So here's the map then completed, and it now leaves us to fold it into a shape that we can actually use it in the air. I'm basically folding it lengthways so that we get rid of most of the unwanted map and then reduce it to the size that we want is the way forward. And that way we can actually hold it in our hands and use it to navigate in the direction that we want to go without it obscuring the whole of the inside of the cockpit, because the Moth cockpit is tighter than a lot of fighter cockpits. Now here we are in a different hotel room, a different t-shirt, but we're still continuing the theme, and I'm just going to have a quick look at how we can mentally adjust our drift angles and our ground speed calculation without having to use a whiz wheel. And we're going to do it using the 1 in 60 rule and what we call the clock code. So let's have a look at what we mean by the 1 in 60 rule first. Basically the idea is that if you're ground speeding, as you can see here, at 60 knots going along, then if you have a 10 knot wind from the side, that will give you a 10 degrees drift. So if you're doing 60 knots, that's very easy. For every knot at 90 degrees, then you end up with a degree of drift. So 10 knots sideways, 10 degrees drift, 20 knots sideways, 20 knots of drift, if that makes sense. Conversely, we'll have a look at what happens if you're doing 120 knots. Whereas for every knot sideways at 60 we got a degree of drift, at 120 airspeed, for every 10 knots sideways we get 5 degrees, so when you get half the drift. So at 120 knots we use half the wind speed, and of course at 90 knots, somewhere in the middle, we're going to use 3/4 of the wind speed will give our maximum drift angle. So that would be for 90, I'll draw it in. So in the middle at a 90 knots ground speed, for every 10 knots of sideways wind we get 7.5 degrees of drift. So of course the reality is that we may not have the wind right on the beam, and it might be at 30 degrees off, 60 or 90 degrees off, and there's a thing called the clock code that we can use to adjust this max drift, so that we can then use that actually in the air to adjust our heading that we're going to steer to acquire our real track required. So let's just have a quick look at the clock code. Okay, so here we've got a circle, and our track is here represented by the straight line upward. And I think it's fairly obvious that if the wind is blowing at 90 degrees, all of that wind will be a crosswind component, and none of it will have a fore and aft, so it's all drift and none of it is going to affect our speed. Now let's have a look at what happens when we've got the wind in at 45 degrees, and you'll see that actually that affects both we've got a crosswind component there, which is about 3/4 of the wind speed, but also about 3/4 of it is acting against us, slowing us down. If you look at the vertical component, about 3/4 of it in the vertical, 3/4 of it in the horizontal plane. So if we're cruising at 60 and gave ourselves a wind speed of 10 knots, we'd effectively have 7.5 knots or 7.5 degrees of drift, and 7.5 knots of it would be slowing us down. So that's at 45 degrees. Now let's have a look at the 60 degree and 30 degree cases. Now at a wind of 30 degrees off the nose, basically half the wind will be a crosswind component and to be honest, most of it, not quite all, but the most of it, for rule of thumb, can actually be thought of as a headwind component. So 30 degrees off, half of it is crosswind. So again, if we had a 10 knots wind there, with ground speeding at 60, we'd have a 5-degree drift to actually make. We need 5 degrees of error. Conversely, we've got nearly all of it actually slowing us down. And the same happens when we've got the wind at 60 degrees off here. So let's just draw that in and have a wee look at that. So here I've drawn one in for the wind 60 degrees off the track, and you can see there that basically nearly all of the wind is drift component, but actually half of it is still headwind component. So those are useful numbers to think about, and the idea of this system is for max drift is that instead of having to use the whiz wheel, we can do this reasonably in our head, thinking, oh, the wind is 60 degrees off, so nearly all of it's going to be drift, but half of it will be a headwind component. Of course, a similar thing would be true if the wind was 60 off the tail, in that, again, nearly all of it would be drift, but half of it would be a tailwind component. So we can actually use this to do an easy calculation and adjustment for our drift angles and our ground speed, but we don't have to use the whiz wheel to do it. And the point of the clock code bit is if you're trying to remember what percentages you use for an angle off. If you think a normal clock, 60 off is at the top, it's everything of the clock, this bit of the hour, and then as you go round the hour, you're going to go round to 15 degrees off, as you can see, is a quarter. You can use 30 off is a half, 45 degrees off is 3/4, and by the time you go on to 60 it's all drift. And so thinking of that and applying it to your angle off allows you to see how much of the wind component is actually affecting your flight. So let's have a look at how that actually works on our real map. Here we've got a heading of 150. Now it's a good idea to draw the wind vector in for the day, and we'll put a wind of 210 at 20 knots at our cruising level, so it'd be a good idea to draw it an arrow with 3 feathered lines to show that on the map and put 20 knots on it. If we want 150 now, 210 is 60 degrees off from the right hand side, so nearly all of it is going to be drift. So on our slow gypsy doing 60 knots ground speed, that's a 20 degree angle of drift, so we're going to need to head into the wind, make our new heading 170 to acquire a track of 150, and half of it is going to be headwind, so we're actually going to have 10 knots of headwind component, so we're going to be cruising at 50 knots ground speed. So every 6 minutes we're actually going to lose a minute from what we've marked on here at the 5-minute mark. So we can expect to get to the 5-minute mark at about minute 6 in real life. And so we can make a mental adjustment to each of these headings before we actually go and fly the aircraft. Time spent route studying is rarely wasted, so a good idea is to take yourself off to the quiet of the loo, sit there, make yourself as comfortable as you can, and think through the whole plan as if you were flying it for real before you climb aboard your aircraft. Remember that you've taken time to plan the flight carefully, choosing good features. So therefore, once you're in the aircraft, fly your plan as accurately as you possibly can. Before each turning point, use the hat checks. Do a pre-hat check, select your heading onto the compass, check the altitude you're going to fly, and that the time is right and the stopwatch is zeroed, ready for the next leg. Set course by looking in the direction you should be going first of all, turn the aircraft onto the heading and allow your compass to settle. You can then refine the heading. Once you're flying along, remember that the aircraft is basically fairly unstable in yaw, so pick a point in the distance and keep the nose on it. Once you've set course, do a post-hat check. Check that the heading on the compass is what you've got on your map or adjusted for wind, the altitude you're flying is correct, and that the stopwatch is running, and what time your next major feature is going to appear. Don't spend too much head of time in the cockpit. Remember, keep your lookout going and always fly using the big features, reading from the map what do I expect to see to the ground. But the fact that you've chosen good features means that you're going to see them. So relax and fly the aircraft accurately between each of your checkpoints. Remember to carry out your Frida checks at a time of low workload, and if you've got a direction indicator, to update it every 10 to 15 minutes. Always try to take some time to enjoy your flight and the beautiful scenery that you're flying over. I hope that you find some of this guidance useful and that you won't need to use all of the techniques that are used in this ultra low level training film for the RAF, but some of it I'm sure you'll find useful and applicable to your own navigation. So here we go with the rest of that RAF film.
Before we go further, let's consider the question of low-level map reading, because it's quite a different proposition from map reading at a height. Look at this piece of country. On the right, there is a small town. In the distance, there is a large wood which could obviously be identified on the map by its size and shape. Now see what the same piece of country looks like flying low. Owing to our smaller field of view, there's no sign of the small town. Towns are only useful if you pass very close to them. Ahead is a wood, but whether it's the big one we saw before, we can't say with certainty. But low-level map reading introduces its own landmarks. From this height, contours mean very little. But at low level, every hillock and dale comes to life and can be compared with the map in detail. Even a small isolated hill like this one. Solitary lakes are good too, provided you pass near them. Railways can be checked by the direction in which they run. Cultivate a mental compass rose to assist you in checking such directions. Other useful landmarks are church spires, power lines, wireless masts, and chimneys of isolated works. Now let's examine our intended track, picking out the salient pinpoints so as to build up a mental picture of the flight. Map reading doesn't concern us much until we cross the far coast. Then the first good landmark is this hill on track, marked as a spot height 419 feet. Next we have this river flowing in a shallow valley parallel to track, and there's a railway at its northern end. Then there is this railway junction running down in a valley to the west. We shouldn't miss that. Now we should see either this town or the main line railway to the west of it, and notice that there is a single track railway joining the two. Finally we come over a hill, shown by the close contour line sloping down to the objective, which is in this large town. When flying, try to keep this picture in your mind. Let's just run over the points again. Point to reach enemy coast, hill, river, railway junction, town, objective. Now we're all set to go. As soon as we are airborne, synchronize the directional gyro with the compass. Red on red. Then set the first course for the first leg across the sea on the compass, 013 degrees. Here's the headland which marks our starting point. Turn to set course accurately over it. On to 013. Time 12:12. Now we can fill in ETA for the next coast. 23.5 minutes. So the ETA will be 12:35.5. For the time being, all we have to do is to maintain course. And keep a constant airspeed . 160 miles per hour. There's the next coast, and there on the left is the end of cliff which marks our turning point. As it's likely to port, we alter course by sight to reach it. Mustn't forget to check the gyro as often as possible. Now we set the course for our second leg on the compass, 349 degrees. Turn to set course accurately over the rocks, on to 349. Time 12:36. Fill in the ETA for our objective. 33.5 minutes. That makes it 13:09.5 at objective. Now we can begin serious map reading. The first thing we can do is to mentally check the angle of crossing the coast. Seems to be okay. Our first landmark is the spot height. According to our time scale, it's between the 5 and 10 minute marks, about 8 minutes after setting course. That is 12:44. There's no point in searching around for a landmark which isn't due. We concentrate on flying a steady course and keeping a good lookout. Just a word about weaving. If you must weave, don't do it violently like this. You'll never be able to maintain track. Make it a gentle weave, not more than 30 degrees either side. That's quite sufficient. There's the spot height, on time, on the port side. You can just see it by the clump of trees on top. As we're not passing over it, it looks as though we're a bit off track, but we'd better sit tight until we get another check. We might get a check when we cross this railway. Meanwhile, we'll stick to course. There's the railway at the bottom of the hill, but notice its direction. It looks as though instead of crossing here, we've crossed it somewhere about here. According to our 10-degree lines, we're about 5 degrees starboard of track. We must alter course about 8 degrees to port. That is 5 degrees track error, plus 3 degrees to regain track. 349 degrees less 8, that is 341. Don't forget that you must concentrate not on the cockpit, but what's going on outside. Hello, here's a river. Looks as though we're close to our next landmark. It's just about due, too. That's the river, which should be on our starboard side. There it is. It's such a shallow valley as to be hardly noticeable. But there is no mistaking the river. We are directly over it, so we are still slightly starboard of track, but we should regain it in a minute or so. Look out for the railway. According to our time scale, we should be there after 18 minutes. That's 12:54, any moment now. There it is. A minute early. We are roughly halfway, so our ETA for the objective will be 2 minutes early, that is 13:07 and a half. We must be about on track now, so we'll alter course to maintain it, about 3 degrees to starboard, that is on to 344. Time for our next landmark. There it is. There's the junction. We're on track. We should be seeing the town soon. Yes, there's a single line track. And there to starboard is the town. Only 5 minutes to go. Don't forget that steep slope down to the objective. Keep an eye on the airspeed. There we are. There's the objective down in the valley. On this flight, no time was wasted scratching about on the map trying to identify odd pinpoints. Keep an eye on the clock, so as to only look for a landmark when it's due. And if you don't see a landmark, don't flap. Stick to your courses and ETAs. Careful flight planning makes navigation a certainty instead of a gamble.